Okay, let's just jump straight into one of the most incredible forensic mysteries in human history. In today's Explainer, we're trying to figure out how a massive, highly advanced Bronze Age metropolis simply vanished. We're talking about the Indus Valley Civilization here. I mean, these people were building absolute wonders while the pyramids of Egypt were still in their infancy. But their end wasn't written down in grand historical records or carved into stone monuments. No, the story of their collapse was buried deep in the mud.
Just picture the sprawling brick ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. At its absolute peak, this civilization covered over 1 million square kilometers across what we now know as Pakistan and northwest India. And they weren't just surviving, they were masters of urban planning. We're talking strict grid-like street layouts, standardized baked clay bricks that were so well made they're still resilient to weathering today, and complex underground sanitation systems that most of the ancient world couldn't even dream of.
You want to know just how sophisticated they were? Consider the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro. It's a literal marvel of ancient engineering. They actually waterproofed this massive structure using a natural tar called bitumen, layering it right beneath the baked bricks. They even engineered complex drainage systems to flush out the old water and continuously bring in the new. This was the society that had completely mastered its environment. Well, or at least that's what they thought.
So it begs the million-dollar question, right? How does a civilization of millions just disappear? How does a society with this insane level of administrative control, advanced infrastructure, and resilience, a society that thrived for hundreds of years, completely disintegrate? The cities were abandoned, their distinct writing system disappeared from history, and the people just scattered.
For a long time, the scholarly consensus was honestly way off base from what we know today. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, historians pointed their fingers at a dramatic Aryan invasion. You know, this idea of a violent external force sweeping in and destroying the cities. Actually, scratch that, because modern scholars have totally abandoned that theory. There's just no archaeological or genetic evidence for it. Instead of ancient war stories, researchers have pivoted to hard, geological data to find the real culprit. And it turns out it was the climate.
The timeline of this era neatly frames our prime suspect. Right in the middle is this 4.2K BP mark, which is just scientists speak for 4,200 years before the present. We see the mature Harappan phase, with all its massive urban planning, abruptly hit a wall and give way to the late Harappan phase, which is a period of severe de-urbanization. This timeline perfectly isolates a massive environmental shift that triggered the entire collapse.
Section 1. Ocean isotopes reveal drought. The 4,000-year-old climate thermometer.
To really understand the connection between these ancient drought cycles and the fall of the Indus Valley, we have to look at a very specific metric, the oxygen isotope ratio. I know it sounds a bit dense, but it basically lets us visualize invisible weather patterns from millennia ago. By measuring the ratio of different stable oxygen isotopes, specifically oxygen 18 to oxygen 16, scientists can figure out the salinity and temperature of ancient waters. It is literally a 4,000-year-old climate thermometer.
And here is how this ancient thermometer actually works in practice. Scientists pulled up a specific sediment core. They call it 63Ka, from the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Pakistan, right near the old Indus Delta. They zoomed in on the tiny shells of ancient plankton buried in that mud. While they were alive, these plankton absorbed oxygen isotopes straight from the water. Because the Indus River used to pump huge amounts of fresh water into the salty ocean, the changing isotope ratios trapped in these tiny shells give us a step-by-step, year-by-year record of exactly how much fresh water the river was discharging.
The geological data tells a pretty terrifying story. Right at that 4,200-year mark, the isotope ratios shifted drastically toward heavier oxygen. What does that mean? It definitively proves that the once mighty Indus River began to dry up. The freshwater discharge absolutely plummeted. And without that constant, massive flow of fresh water, the agricultural lifeblood that urban survival depended on was completely choked off. Now, we are not just talking about a bad summer or a localized dry spell here. The data shows a severe, multi-centurial systemic failure of the region's climate. The South Asian summer monsoon was completely disrupted. But even worse, the winter and spring precipitation, which fed the crucial glaciers that kept the Indus River flowing year-round, dropped off a cliff. Researchers tie this directly to global fluctuations in solar radiation, which tracks right alongside reduced cosmogenic carbon-14 production. Basically, the entire global atmospheric flow went completely out of whack.
And this drought didn't just kill local crops. It's like a giant domino effect. The Harappans relied heavily on this intricate, long-distance trade network with places like Mesopotamia, trading things like carnelian beads and textiles. But right at that same time, 4,200 years ago, Mesopotamia and Egypt were getting slammed by their own devastating climate crises. The trade networks entirely severed, so the Indus Valley was essentially cut off, isolated, and starving.
Section 2. Disease, Survival, and Climate. The Biosocial Collapse. Okay, so moving from the cold, hard environmental data to the actual visceral human cost, the archaeological record paints a really grim picture. When reduced river discharge made urban survival impossible, the decline wasn't just some peaceful, organized migration out to the countryside. As the water ran out, these dense urban centers suffered a brutal biosocial collapse. It was a desperate, violent struggle for survival in a crumbling metropolis where the basic necessities for life just vanished. The numbers here are just staggering. Back during the peak mature Harappan phase, diseases like leprosy existed, sure, but at a really low prevalence. Fast forward to the late Harappan phase, and everything changes. In a site called Cemetery H, the infection rate for leprosy and tuberculosis shoots up to over 15%. And even more shocking, in a burial site known as Area G, an unprecedented 50% of the skeletons show signs of violent interpersonal trauma. Half of them. But crucially, this suffering was not distributed equally among the population.
Bioarchaeologists call this phenomenon the pathology of power. As the water and food vanished, those legendary Harappan sanitation systems just broke down. People overcrowded into whatever habitable zones were left, which caused infectious diseases to surge. But because the violence and disease were so heavily concentrated in very specific burial populations, it tells us that a deeply unequal social structure left marginalized groups to bear the absolute worst of the crisis. The state was weakening and decentralizing, and it simply wouldn't or couldn't protect them.
The researchers studying these human remains hit the nail on the head with this quote. They note that observing the intersection between climate change and social processes offers incredibly valuable lessons about vulnerability. It's a stark reminder that environmental collapse doesn't just hit everyone equally, it actively exploits the existing fractures and inequalities within a society. So, to wrap up the key takeaways of this explainer, the Great Indus Valley Civilization didn't fall to foreign invaders on horseback. Instead, modern oceanic data definitively confirms that a massive drought cycle altered the global climate 4,200 years ago. The mighty Indus River shrank, starving those meticulously planned cities. This extreme resource crisis triggered a violent, completely unequal biosocial collapse, where marginalized folks were devastated by disease and violence. Ultimately, the survivors had no choice but to abandon city life entirely and migrate eastward to simpler rural villages. I really want to leave you with this provocative thought today. If a highly advanced civilization of millions, one with incredible engineering, sprawling global trade networks, and hundreds of years of stability, could totally fracture and fall to a climate shift, how resilient are we today? It is a chilling question for sure, and definitely one worth pondering. Thanks so much for diving into this explainer with me.